Hello, everyone. This is Dorie Clark, and I am here as part of our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. We are here with our special guest today. His name is Alexander Rose. He is with the Long Now Foundation, and we're going to be discussing how to become a better long term thinker. And when we say long term, I wrote a book about long term thinking. It's called The Long Game. This is child's play because the Long Now Foundation is meant to talk about 10,000 year intervals. So it's an exciting question to get into. Xander, welcome and great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Dory.
Fantastic. And hello to everyone who's tuning in. Please feel free to type into the chat box who you are and where you are calling in from. We'd love to say hi, and we'd also love to take your questions for Xander. So the first question that comes to mind, Xander, if people have heard of the Long Now Foundation, you have a lot of exciting projects, which I would certainly love to hear more about. But perhaps in the popular imagination, what you are most associated with is mammoths. Can you talk to us a little bit about the woolly mammoth, what that has to do with the Long Now Foundation, and how that shapes your overall philosophy in thinking about time?
Absolutely. It was a project that we incubated and have actually spun off, but it was called Revive and Restore, and the idea with that project is that you know we as a human species over the last 10,000 years have extincted many species, including things like mammoth. It's assumed that that was largely done. That extinction was largely a human-caused event, and we haven't had the tools for the last 10,000 years to correct that in any meaningful way until very recently with genetic engineering, that we have the ability to use genetic engineering to both solve bottlenecks, potential genetic bottlenecks for species that are about to go extinct, so like the northern white rhino or something like that. And we have the technology to potentially bring back species that have been extinct even for a few thousand years. Not Jurassic Park level, that's millions of years where we don't really have valid DNA, but from a few thousand years that something's been stored, let's say in ice or in tundra, like a mammoth, remains of a mammoth, we do have fairly intact DNA. And so the idea is really to figure out, which of these species that if we brought them back would be not only, it's a kind of a lovely kind of imaginative thing, but that would actually be better, help the environment or the planet in some way. And the mammoth is really interesting because it did a thing in the northern parts of the world, most of the continents of the world, that actually changed stamped down snow and rutted up the earth and kept and basically those things allow for the tundra to stay colder for longer. And it's this kind of amazing thing that would allow the methane to stay in the northern climes for much longer than if there weren't mammoths roaming around. So the hope is to be able to bring back this kind of amazing species that I think would be really amazing to have walking around on the earth again, but also that it could in large numbers help improve the bad effects of climate change.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. We're here with Alexander Rose. He is with the Long Now Foundation, and we're talking about becoming a long term thinker. If you want to learn more about what the Long Now Foundation does, just check it out at longnow.org. And we also want to say hi to some of the great folks who are tuning in and joining us today. Thanks for being here. Latanya from Baltimore, Pau from Spain. We have DT from Rochester, Catherine in DC. We have Vashmi Jahan from Azerbaijan, Farah from California, Naoko from Orlando, Vinod from Pakistan, Bernhard, hi from Munich. We have Marion from Jasper, Georgia. Joy is here. Brandy from Spokane. Salima is here from the Bay Area. So many great friends and more. If you have questions for Alexander Rose at the Long Now Foundation, please type them into the chat box. Now, Xander, another thing that I'm curious about. I obviously am a believer in the value of long-term thinking, but for anyone who is a skeptic or perhaps a skeptic of the idea like 10,000 years, we're not going to be around. Why is this the time frame? Why do we need to bother to think in such huge increments? Give us the pitch here. Why is what the Long Now Foundation doing so important?
Well, the goal is to choose a kind of a timeline that is kind of encompasses the modern human experience. And 10,000 years is roughly when agriculture began, and the last ice age was retreating, and we started settling down in cities in large amounts, in large kind of numbers around the world. So that 10,000 years was chosen as something that's, kind of stretches the imagination, but is really our kind of modern civilizational moment. But it's not really just about looking forward 10,000 years. It's also a little bit about looking back 10,000 years and seeing ourselves. I think we often, especially with kind of apocalyptic storytelling, we kind of feel like, just like you said, are we going to be around in 10,000 years? And we feel like we're at the end potentially of a 10,000 year human story. But I think if you kind of reframe that a little bit and you go, well, actually, maybe we're in the middle of at least a 20,000 year story. How would we act differently if we thought that we were going to be around for the next 10,000 years? And, I think people do talk about a lot of things in apocalyptic terms, like climate change, which is a very serious thing. But I think, while it may change the carrying capacity of this planet or make for some very difficult living conditions, for sure, I think, humanity is probably going to be around even with some really bad effects of climate change. And there's very few things that are truly existential threats. So if we are going to be around for the next 10,000 years, why not, kind of act like it and potentially, do things for the planet or for society or, even locally that act in that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you, Xander. Again, we're with Alexander Rose. He is with the Long Now Foundation, and we're talking about how to become a long-term thinker. We want to say hi to some of the great international friends who are joining us today. We have Ambra from Milan, Katya is from Russia, we have Anna up in New Hampshire, we have a LinkedIn user from Havre de Grace, Maryland, we have Layla from Prague, Stuart from Texas, Zelda from South Africa, and Sri Lakshmi from India. We're so glad to have all of you here joining us talking about how to become a better long-term thinker. Now, Xander, I'm curious. You have a new initiative that I know that you're especially interested in. This is something that makes, I think, a big difference for people in the business world. So I want to dive into this a little bit. It actually ties in with a question that Anna has for us. She's curious about what's the mindset of a long-term thinker and the culture of a long time scale organization. You are developing something as we speak called the Organizational Continuity Project. What is it, and why is this something that is relevant for us?
Well, the idea of the organizational continuity project really stemmed out of trying to figure out how we at Long Now could become a long-term organization. And I started looking around and looking for the books on the longest-lived organizations in the world and the experts in the field, and realized there's almost none. And there was very little kind of original research in this area that wasn't maybe more esoteric and academic, but something more talking with the current leaders of the longest-lived companies and things like that. And so we began that initiative in the last few years, and we've just begun that research. But you start learning just some of these amazing things about the longest lived organizations in the world, some of which go back, obviously with things like the Catholic Church, almost 2,000 years. But when you get into companies that are largely in Japan, they go back, 1,400 years, 1,600 years, and I think the most interesting thing to me about this is many of these organizations or companies are they're products of a very specific circumstance. Like they worked for basically the royal family of Japan or something like that. But some are companies that have found their way through everything from the Black Plague to the last pandemic to this pandemic to wars, and have somehow figured out how to navigate that. And I think that's a really amazing thing, is if we can figure out what those kind of more portable lessons are that are less circumstantial, and then think about them as we build our new institutions that we might want to last for a very long time, and take and use those lessons.
Interesting. Xander, can you give us a bit of a preview? What have you been extracting from your learning about the Organizational Continuity Project, and how have you been applying it to what the Long Now Foundation is doing?
Well, again, this is fairly early, so we're not yet into the application phase. But I think the one of the things that keeps coming up is this I keep finding that there seems to be people in these organizations that are in some way kind of the organizational storyteller. Sometimes they're in official capacities where companies or something will have an actual historian. Sometimes there are these much more informal roles. I found a great term that's used in England, which is called keeper of the fabric, it's actually used for the person, this kind of administrative person who helps cathedrals last through time. And they're some of the longest lived buildings we have in the world. So this idea of this keeper of the fabric, this person that keeps the story going from generation to generation and tells the stories of the ways that the institution made it through difficult times and good times and in between, that help, hopefully don't, kind of overwhelm the institution with history so it can't change, but enough so that it doesn't make the same mistakes twice, or can at least learn from the mistakes that were made.
Yeah, so interesting. And we want to say hi to some of the terrific friends who are tuning in to join us live. Zach is here from New York. Karen's here from Boston. Eduardo's saying hello. Andre's visiting us from the UK. And Luis is here from Brazil. Welcome all. We are here with Alexander Rose of the Long Now Foundation. If you want to learn more about the Long Now Foundation's work, just check them out at longnow.org. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of our weekly Newsweek interview shows, just follow me on LinkedIn. You can go to dorieclark.com/li. You can follow me. You can subscribe to my LinkedIn newsletter, where every week we send reminders about our great upcoming guests who will be joining us. And we have, if you have questions for Xander, please type them into the chat box. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. I am actually personally curious, Xander. You have this job working for the Long Now Foundation. I am curious, can you tell us a little bit about what your background is and essentially how one becomes qualified? I say in air quotes because ultimately we all make ourselves qualified, but what has qualified you to dive in and immerse yourself in the world of long-term thinking? There's obviously not a clear roadmap for how one does that. So what was your path to the organization?
Yes, well, there's not a degree right now in long-term thinking, which maybe that will change in the future. But the my path was, I grew up in the waterfront of a town here in the Bay Area called Sausalito. That was kind of this old funky, literally a junkyard, and I grew up building things my whole life, and then eventually went to industrial design school. And the project, as I was starting it 25 years ago, the very first project that we were working on at Long Now was to build a 10,000 year mechanical clock as a kind of icon to long-term thinking. And some of the founders of Long Now, people like Stuart Brand, who started the Whole Earth catalog, were based here in Sausalito, and I knew them from here. And he told me about this project and this idea of, as somebody who has built, who loves building things, the idea of building something to last purposefully, and a machine to last purposefully for 10,000 years, was just super intriguing to me. So I started working on that project. This is now back in 1997, so 25 years ago. And we've been working on that project ever since too, and I'm working on the monument scale version now. And so hopefully in a few years that will be done. But in the meantime, we've also, as you mentioned, some of these other projects that we're trying to figure out, ways of, like a 10,000 year clock. Just hearing that term somehow changes something in your mind, and you start asking new kinds of questions. And even if you, let's say, are skeptical that a 10,000 year clock could be built, if you start telling me why that can't be built and that won't work, you now have engaged in long-term thinking, right? You're thinking thousands of years in the future, and what the failure modes might be, whether they're societal or mechanical. So that's really the kind of thing that we're trying to do, is capture people's imagination in a way that gets them to have a kind of conversation about the future, and the past and their place in it in a different way.
Ah, that's so interesting. I love that. We have great friends tuning in. We have even more. We have Gabriel here from Mexico, Eduardo from Portugal, Shama from Texas, Nathaniel, who used to live in Sausalito and says hello, and Lynn from DC. We're glad that you are here. We're speaking with Alexander Rose of the Long Now Foundation about how to become a better long-term thinker. And Xander, I would love to get your perspective. A lot of the folks who are watching this, they are professionals in the business world in one capacity or another. They might work in an organization. They might be entrepreneurs. if someone really wanted to commit themselves to long-term thinking, they like the idea of it, they think it sounds good, they are bought in, but they say, I really don't know where to start. What would you advise someone as a means of beginning the process of reorienting ourselves so that we can all become better long-term thinkers?
Well, I think there's a number of things. We run a lecture series based out of the Bay Area. It's all online. There's all kinds of people ranging from Neil Gaiman, the author, to scientists and astronauts and other thinkers that are kind of share their perspective on long-term thinking, which I think is interesting because you can kind of find your own way in, which might be a topic that is of interest to you. There's the book that Stuart Brand wrote on this project called Clock of the Long Now. I think is still really relevant and great. A much more recent book by Roman Kurznerek, who wrote a book recently called "Becoming," I think, How to Be a Better Ancestor, basically, and that comes from the Jonas Salk quote of, we need to be better ancestors or become better ancestors, and I think that's a that's a those are a few ways in. But I think one of the things that we're really trying to talk about here is that, nobody has to think 10,000 years. We realize we're the weirdos thinking 10,000 years in advance. But even if you're a business leader and you're thinking about, whether the product that you're making, what its end of life cycle is, or just think a little bit longer than you would normally, and how that product or how the service is affecting society over the long term. I think we're currently living in a world where a lot of people didn't think through that very well, and we're stuck with a lot of kind of things that we thought were really neat when they came out, and now are affecting elections and not the way that we intended them to, and seem very sustainable. So I think making sure that you kind of think through some of these things and take a moment to ask the question of, what if this is really successful? What might make be bad about that? So I think those are the kind of things that we hope people get a little bit more reflective about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And certainly it ties in with some of the questions that I see coming in. Thank you to everyone who's submitting your questions for Alexander Rose of the Long Now Foundation. If you're enjoying this conversation, please hit the like button and the share button so that your friends and colleagues can benefit from it as well. So I think this is an important one, Xander, and it ties in with the point you were just making. A LinkedIn user has asked us, how can I identify worthwhile new ideas or opportunities I can implement today or in the near future? They say a long-term or very long-term vision actually can be very wrong. Certainly, we can all think about examples of things that people thought were a fantastic idea 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. That has been disproven, to your point. So they go on to say, my question is, how do I improve my chances to have practical long-term thinking? How can we make sure, if we actually are thinking long-term, that we're not doing it in some kind of a devastatingly deleterious fashion?
Yeah, I think this is a good moment to differentiate like long-term planning from long-term thinking. And long-term planning can be very it's you're basically going to be wrong a lot. And the type of thing that we're talking about, and to the questioner's point, there is bad long-term thinking, right? Like, Hitler started what he called the 1,000-year Reich. Like, we're all pretty glad that is not how that played out, right? So there's values associated with long-term thinking. There's how you go about it. But I think one of the kind of principles that I think that I use a lot and has been emergent in a lot of our work that might be helpful for the person asking this question is, are the things that you are doing increasing optionality for the future or decreasing it? And choices that increase optionality for the future are the ones that we wish our ancestors kind of left us. Like, instead of being left with less choices about what we can do environmentally, policy wise, all these things that we kind of get left with, let's say, less old growth forest than the generation before. Now we have less optionality about how we want to protect that or use that forest. If we create laws that are so restrictive that the future generations can never reinterpret them. If you look at something like the Bill of Rights, it was meant to be reinterpreted. It's principle based, right? And for better or worse, we continue to reinterpret those those things, but at least we have that opportunity where you look at a modern law that's 1,000 pages long. Its intent is very much to make sure the future can never interpret it in a different way. And the future, those people know way more about their present than we can possibly project from our point in their past. So the idea is to, rather than to restrict future generations, is to increase their optionality and to trust them that they have a better view of their present than we can possibly imagine.
I love that, and I'm very much in agreement, Xander, that increasing optionality, certainly, even if we're talking about the more typical human lifespan that I talk about in the long game, we do need to create a portfolio of activities for ourselves. We need to hedge our bets, protect against downside, and find ways to increase optionality because we don't know what is coming in the future. So I think that's a great point. And to that point, Gina in Florida, hi, Gina. She says she loves the conversation. It seems to require thinking about the human commons, as in, we think about avoiding the tragedy of the commons. So, how can we be better at that? Just as much as the time dimension. She wants to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this. It's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it in the kind of human commons idea. Um, I think that fundamentally, what we want to do is, I think we're not trying to create a situation where you get kind of bogged down in feeling too responsible for every single choice that you make. And that goes back to this optionality thing, that if what you're doing is helping people have kind of more freedom in the future rather than less, more levers to pull, and about their present, that's I think that's really where we're trying to go with that. I'm not sure how this ties it. Maybe can you say more what you think the human commons is? So I'm struggling a bit with that idea.
Good point, Gina. If you feel like it, please type into the chat box and share a little bit more about that. I'm assuming that what Gina's talking about is kind of a collective responsibility to one another and to our future descendants, to not over exploit certain resources and thereby decrease the optionality that you're talking about. But that would be my interpretation.
Yeah, no, I mean that makes sense, and I think that I do think that there are ways of thinking about this that can feel a bit confining because you get so worried about the downside effects, and people use things like the precautionary principle to kind of never do anything, like something like genetically engineering a species back into the world. People get really, well, what if that species runs amok, and you have this, the
And
Jurassic
then
Park
we're
kind
all
of
killed by mammoths.
scenario, right?
Thanks, Xander.
Right, exactly. But you look at that, you're like, well, we extincted this mammoth, a mammoth thousands of years ago with spears. Like, if the mammoth really is a problem, I don't think we're going to have a problem re-extincting it again. And so, you kind of have to look at those things and go, well, okay, there could be some downsides of this. Let's think about them carefully, but let's not make it so stifling that we don't try new things, and try new ways of solving some of the problems that we've created over the last 10,000 years.
That's a really interesting point. We don't want to get so cautious that we are fearful of trying anything. Really good point to keep in mind. And Sri Lakshmi has written in, Xander, with a question. She's curious, how do character and mindset tie into the principle of long-term thinking? Do you feel like there's certain elements around how to cultivate the character or the way of thinking that can actually help us get better at this?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think we've just been talking about some of the principles that we do get to around increasing optionality and things like that. I think if let's say you're a product designer and you're charged with making a new pen. There's at least two ways of making a pen. One is the Mont Blanc, that's an object that someone will keep and use for the rest of their lives potentially, and one is a cheap plastic disposable pen. And they both have a place in the world, but if you're making a disposable pen, maybe it should be something that biodegrades at some point, or at least has a better chance of that, or as a material that is much more reusable rather than, and if you're making something that's the Mont Blanc, like you can make it out of really nice materials and it's going to last for a really long time. So I think, it's, I mean, choose your kind of wherever you are in your life and think, all right, well, am I making a something that's going to last for a really long time and people are going to have to deal with and think about and engage with, or am I making something that is fast? There's a place for fast thinking and fast, fashion and art are all in this category, and even modern technology, getting people figuring things out. Like, we want to be able to innovate quickly, but I think it's just worth thinking about carefully where we do that and how we do that, and at least having a few percent of the thoughts around an idea be about what its long-term ramifications might be. And then I think, to the questioner's point, thinking about that as a very iterative process. You are not going to get it right first, especially when you're talking about something over very long periods of time. So don't think about it as, how do I think about long term, once at the very beginning of something, but how do you integrate that into your process, where every little bit you kind of go, okay, now what's going on? How does this affect this? And so I think being very being humble about your ability to predict the future, and being iterative in your thinking, and kind of building those kind of cycles into thinking, rather than trying to think that you might do it kind of monolithically from the beginning.
Yeah, I really love that. We need to take the pressure off sometimes. We often put too much on ourselves to get it right the first time, when it's almost impossible to do that without data and without experience. So, understanding that long term thinking is a process, and one that we're going to need to revisit, is definitely important. We are talking with Alexander Rose of the Long Now Foundation. Check them out at longnow.org. If you want to learn more about my book, The Long Game, which is admittedly much shorter term than 10,000 years, but nonetheless long when it comes to your career, you can learn more at dorieclark.com/the long game. You can download a free long game strategic thinking self-assessment. And we are beginning to come in for the close, Xander, but we have just a few more questions that have come in from our great viewers from around the world. And Anna is curious. She wants to know if you have a perspective about culture or age, and how that ties in with long term thinking. Have you found cultural differences in terms of receptivity to long term thinking, or what are you discovering in terms of people's likelihood to cotton on to these principles?
Well, I mean, I think, on us going to the age question, obviously, when you were a baby, you were very in the now, you were very in the moment, and and the very young people, I think, have a harder time thinking very far in advance. And, and I think grandparents have a little bit different perspective as they see generations within their family, let's say. And sometimes that can be either give them a lot of long-term insight, or it can be a bit, they kind of feel like they're at the end of their life, and they can affect things. But there seems to be this kind of sweet spot in age that can obviously start in as early as your teens or your 20s, where you start going, well, I'm going to be living in this world for the next possibly century, and what do I want to do in it? How do I want to make it better? And that seems to be a time that I think is a really interesting time to think about the arc of your whole life, rather than what is the job that I'm doing for the next day. What do you want to do? What do you want to accomplish? How do you want to make the world better, for potentially the next generation that might be your kids or your grandkids? So I think those are some interesting times. I think in terms of cultures, for sure, I mentioned that some of the oldest organizations in the world overwhelmingly come from Japan. And that's, a bit of that is an accident of history, of the way it was isolated enough. While it suffered, invasions and losses of wars, it was never completely decimated. Like England, kind of has this similar properties, also isolated a bit from the continent, but not totally. And so, those are cultures that we see a lot of long-term thinking. I think the question is they also are not necessarily the cultures that are most known for radical innovation. Certainly, England was at one point, and Japan at some point was as well. But sometimes that kind of deep history can be stifling. And so, how do you? I think one of the reasons the West Coast of the U.S., while there is a deep cultural history here that is, not that is indigenous and is not the culture of the people that are currently seen as the innovators here now, that kind of not being held in those old ways and not feeling that history, and generations of, if you're the 14th generation of someone running a business, that can be a little bit daunting, right? Like, please don't screw it up. And by the way, don't change a lot. So, how do you, if the whole world was 14th generation businesses, that's kind of a difficult place for innovation to happen. So, you want places that have really deep history that we can learn from. We want places that feel very freed from past generations to do radical kind of innovation. And I think where you put yourself in that, and or how you cross those over a little bit so that they can learn from each other, I think is an interesting question.
That's fantastic. We all, in our own businesses and our own lives, need to learn the right way for us to thread the needle between innovation and continuity. So it's a fascinating insight. Again, we've been talking with Alexander Rose of the Long Now Foundation. Learn more at longnow.org. And we'll be back next Thursday and every Thursday with Newsweek's interview show Better. You can learn more, sign up for a free self-assessment and weekly updates at DorieClark.com. Xander, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care, everyone, and see you next week.